but there actually is strategy and technique to successful and effective practice. Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Onyie and this is Onyie Sings. Welcome everyone. And thank you for joining me today. So today's lesson is going to be about how to practice voice. Because I learned recently that a lot of people don't really know how to practice voice. How do you practice singing? And I know that it seems like it makes sense to just start singing. Like practicing singing seems obvious, but there actually is strategy and technique to successful and effective practice for the voice, and it's something that I require of all of my students. Also, as a professional performer and vocalist who went to college for voice and have lived the majority of my life doing voice, it's incredibly essential to practice, and I recognize the importance, the necessity of practice. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps me out so much, and I so appreciate each and every one of you. So what is the point of practice? Well, I'll start with practice should be thoughtful, practical, and useful. Progress is the purpose of practice. Lots of P's. Oh, my poor microphone. I have not used this microphone like this before, so I'm praying that this is not popping too much, and hopefully this microphone is not causing too much of a distraction being in the shot. So yes, progress is the purpose of practice, and there is such a thing as bad practice. Some of the hallmarks of bad practice are fatigue, which can create diminishing returns in your practice. Also, ingraining bad habits, like really setting them in stone for yourself. And then also, it can lead to a lack of motivation because you are not seeing any return on your investment. You're not actually seeing progress. So I've decided to create a checklist of some effective practice techniques. Now, these are my personal techniques based on my experience as a teacher and as a vocalist. This is just ideas. These are not set in stone. This is more of a starting point for anyone. You can absolutely take what I teach here and do your own thing with it. But sometimes we just need to know, where do I even begin to create a strategy for effective practice? And hopefully this checklist will give you at least a starting place and maybe even an effective strategy for your personal practice. These are 4 techniques that you can put into a checklist for practical and effective practice. First, plan ahead. So here's what planning ahead entails. For one, knowing the length of time you want to practice. And we want to be practical about the amount of time that we give ourselves. So consider what your actual schedule is like and how you work when you create the time. Also, include breaks. Absolutely include breaks. You are going to need them. Also include your warm-up. It is so important that you warm up, and so often, including my own students, they will not warm up before they practice, and you're not going to have a great practice session if you're not warm. You'll run into issues that are actually just the result of not having a warm voice. Then you might stick around on something you don't need to spend a lot of time doing, because the problem isn't a technique issue. It is really more, you just need to warm up. And by the end of your session, it will feel like you've made progress because now you're warm, and not knowing that you weren't warm before will make being warm feel like progress. So we definitely want to create a length of time that includes the breaks and a warm-up. Another aspect of planning ahead is having a goal for the end of your practice, as well as considering your overall goal. If I'm working on a song, I want to know that in this practice session, we're going to fix measures 5 through 10 because 5 through 10 keeps tripping me up. So the focus of this practice is measures 5 through 10. But my overall goal is to get this song in my body and to get it memorized and to get the technique flawless. Knowing what your overall goal is as well as the session goal will also help keep your practice super focused. Speaking of focus, The next check on our checklist would be, what is the focus of this practice? When you begin practicing a song, for instance, what I'll often do is start with a breakdown for that first practice. So the overall breakdown will include, what is the purpose of the song? What is the story I'm telling? What are my objectives? Like, what is the song even about? So often, especially when you're working in school or anything like that, where you're given songs and the songs are meant to teach you techniques and things like that, oftentimes we'll forget to find out what the song is actually about or even know what we're singing about as we sing it. And that's not even necessarily the song being in a different language. But if you are, for instance, an opera singer or anybody like that, where you do sing in different languages, definitely make sure you know the translation of your song so that you are able to sing it effectively and with understanding, and again, being able to tell a story. Next, we want to make sure that we are marking our breaths. This is a big one. I constantly tell my students about this because so often we forget to consider the breaths when we're learning music. It is so important because the breath is the foundation of healthy vocal production. And so if we want to make sure that we are singing the song the best we can, we need to make sure that our breaths are intact. And one of the things that will help is making sure that your breaths become muscle memory. What we do is we mark them in the music. In pretty much any music that I've ever learned and practiced, what we used for the breath marking was an apostrophe. So you can put an apostrophe right where you want to take those breaths in your sheet music, or even when I have lyrics. For instance, when I'm doing gigging, oftentimes I'll just have a lyric sheet. Then I'll just put a little apostrophe. I always want to say comma. I'll put a little apostrophe where I want the breaths to be. Another thing people will use is check marks. So whatever to you says, take a breath, use that as your way to remind yourself in your music where to breathe, and practice that when you are practicing. You want to get to the point where you don't have to think about the breaths anymore. They're as much a part of the music as the notes are. So we want to start doing that almost immediately when we get music or choose music. If you are also choosing songs for auditions or anything where you're going to have to cut the music, cut it immediately. Again, another thing you want to do in the beginning when you're starting to work with this music is make sure that you know what the cut is, especially if it's one of those cuts where you're going to quilt together a bunch of the measures to make something that works in, say, 32 bars if you're doing an audition. You definitely want to know what your cut is and start practicing that specific cut and get that into your body and get that muscle memoried, as opposed to learning the whole song, getting the muscle memory of the whole song, and then having to unteach yourself what has now become a part of you to try to do an awkward cut. Usually I would say definitely learn the whole song, especially with my own students. Absolutely, I do not want you to have songs in your repertoire that you only know the cut of. However, when we're first working on it, learn the cut first. It is a lot easier to then go around and go back to learning the whole thing all the way through. But what you don't want to do is have it so in your body the original way that when you have the nerves and the anxiety that comes up, you end up going into what your muscles have memorized, which is the original way of doing it and not the cut. And one of my favorite things to do in the beginning of learning a song is listen to the accompaniment by itself. Once you know that accompaniment, you'll start to learn things about the song you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. When I talk about accompaniment, I mean either your piano accompaniment, or if you're working with an orchestra or anything like that. If you get the chance to just listen to the instrumental by itself, no matter what kind of instrumental it is, it can do wonders for your understanding of where you fit in the music. And this also works even if you're using karaoke tracks, especially actually if you're using karaoke tracks. You can sit and just listen to the track, and you might even hear things like drums that are doing really cool things or horns that are doing really cool things. Sometimes some of these things will actually give you the thing that you need to do next. For instance, the drum might give you a beat that gives you an easier way of coming into the next section of the song, or the trumpet is actually the melody you're about to sing. So if you don't already know that, then you don't know that the band or the backing track is helping you out actually, which is really awesome when that happens. Another aspect of focusing your practice is focusing your practice around technique. For instance, if you're practicing technique with a song, then you're going to utilize that song to check in on technique things. If it's a placement issue, I want to make sure that I'm placing everything in my mask appropriately. Then you need to consider that as you are singing through your song. Make sure that all the vowels are being placed where they're supposed to be placed, that the consonants are helping put you in your correct place, all these kinds of little things that go into helping you with your technique. If your purpose for the practice or your focus is technique and you're not using a song, then you want to use exercises that will help you continue to work on that technique. If I'm doing, again, trying to make sure I'm really accessing my mask, then I'd want to use my vocalises, my vocal exercises that deal with a mask. For instance, nya, 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 for anyone who knows that. But that is one of those ones that helps you really engage more forward placement, nasal placement, mask ringing placement. So any of those exercises that really help put you into your mask is what you would use for a practice where the focus is technique. So make sure you go into that technique practice knowing what technique you're focusing on and what exercises you want to do. Also, another focus of your practice might be musicality or musical expression. And when you're doing that, when you're working with a song, it's a lot easier with a song. That way you can just really pay attention to what you are trying to say, the story you're telling, and using musicality as a way of expressing that. That includes dynamics, phrasing, things like that that will help get the story across and help you further express the music. And next on our checklist of practice techniques, we have the rule of 7. Now, this is something I created myself from my own experience in practice rooms struggling through songs. What I would notice is that when I would get to a place that I'd have a really struggle bus issue with music, I would either run through it and try not to touch it and just keep practicing the parts that I knew well, or I would run it into the ground until I could not stand it, even stop making progress with it and almost give up basically. There is nothing that will undo motivation like diminishing returns. And when you just keep hammering at yourself, that is what happens. What I learned in college, I believe, was that when I would find a section that was a bit difficult for myself, let's say it was an issue of memorizing the lyrics for 5 measures. 5 measures of this song just always go away from me and I cannot get these lyrics in my mouth and I cannot get them memorized. I would then work through, just really make sure I get the lyrics and understand them and know what they're supposed to be. Then I would start practicing doing it off book. And I would give myself 7 tries to do it correctly in a row. So 7 times in a row, sing those 5 measures correctly. Now the tricky part was, anytime I messed up, I had to go back to 1. So the idea was to only do it 7 times in a row. But if I got to the 4th time in a row and that's when I messed up, going back to 1, and now we still need to try to do 7 times in a row perfectly. Now, when I say 5 measures, that's a lot, I know, but actually more often than not, you'll probably need to use this for something that's just a measure long, like just a couple notes that you're just not getting, or a word or two that you keep flubbing, and you stop and just do this rule of 7. By the time you get to the place where 7 times in a row you do it perfectly, it is in your body. And so you're very likely to not have to have this issue again. And so the rule of 7 has always been very effective for me. And then I also use it with my students, and they also find it very effective in practice. It does take quite a bit of patience, with the tedium possibly, but it is a lot easier to deal with the annoyingness of that repetition because you're actually seeing immediate results. One tip with the rule of 7 is to definitely make sure you take deep breaths, especially if you run into something where you got to the 6th time around. And the 6th time around is when you mess up and have to start again. Take a deep breath. In the early days of doing this, I would get flustered and get upset and quickly get back into the 7. Like I mess up at 6, and start again at 1 and just go right into it. And then I would flub at 2, and then I would flub at 1, and then so it just becomes a mess very quickly. If you have one of those moments where you flub at number 6 or you flub in 7, stop, take a deep breath. get that heart rate back down, get the fight or flight out of your body, and start again. You are there to make mistakes and to get better in those mistakes. So you have to give yourself room to mess up. And if you're going to tear yourself apart every time you do, it will make practicing just a horror show to have to do. And funny enough, you'll start to find that you don't want to practice anymore. It's not because you don't enjoy practicing, it's because you're not nice to yourself when you practice, which makes practicing not fun. And our last check on this checklist is grace. Speaking of which, I remember back when I was in college, I will never forget this day that I was in the practice rooms. I went in during the morning. Our practice rooms didn't have windows, so you could go in the practice room and just kind of forget the day. It was almost like sensory deprivation kind of situation. I went into the practice room, was practicing my heart out over a few arias I was struggling with. I was very hard on myself, practiced for many hours. I think I might have left the room just to get like a sip of water at one time. Hours and hours of practice. By the time I realized I needed to leave, I had almost lost my voice. I was vocally tired, I was physically tired, I was entirely dehydrated. I walked out of the practice rooms and it was dark outside. I had been practicing the literal entire day. And by the time I left the practice room, I was worse off than I was when I went in that morning because of all the things I did, how much I was attacking myself, how much I was dragging myself through that practice. It was so ineffective and so fatiguing, and in the end undid any of the good I had done at the beginning of the practice. So those diminishing returns will make you not return to your practice. And on top of that, it teaches you bad habits when it comes to practice, and it can end up damaging you. Like for instance, losing your voice when you practice is damage. I enjoy practicing because I see results, I see progress, things get better when I practice. But back when I used to tear myself apart, I did not enjoy practicing. I'd rather try it out in front of people and see what happens rather than go through the anxiety and turmoil of what I would put myself through when I practiced. Once I understood you're doing it to yourself, the calls are coming from inside the house, that made it a lot easier and helped my practice sessions so much. One of the things we have to remember is practice is practice. Like, it is not something where we are supposed to be performing and perfection yet. We want to aim for progress, not perfection. Where am I currently? So I can even gauge when I am seeing progress. First, you have to know where you are. And in knowing where you are, you have to be patient with that fact. The truth is, I'm here. And now, when I continue practicing, when I see growth, when I see progress, I'll be aware of it and actually able to give myself credit for it because I knew where I was before and where I am now. So it's super important that we allow ourselves the room to make mistakes and to be on a journey of getting better, because that's the whole purpose of practice. It is progress, not perfection. I did have a teacher who used to say, perfect practice makes perfect. And to me, what that is having a strategy that's effective. That is perfect practice. It's not perfection by way of what you're producing. It's perfection by way of having a good strategy for progress. Also understand, especially if you're young, you're going to get better. Like, you're just always going to be getting better. So there is a better to get, meaning that where you are now is not where you're going, if that makes sense. So you have to give yourself room for that. Recognize that there will always be better. You're never going to be in a place where I've hit the ceiling of how good I'm ever gonna be. That's just not, especially again, if you're young. For instance, for women, we don't even come into full vocal maturity till we're 30. There are people who will leave singing because they have a hard time with their voice in their 20s. Young lady, give yourself a break and know with time, it will continue to get better. You will continue to get better and you have no idea what your ceiling is, and you likely never will. You're always going to be getting better as long as you are using good technique, learning healthy vocal production, and practicing well. Also, you don't necessarily want to constantly give yourself a pat on the back just for showing up, but you do want to recognize when you are making progress, and you do want to give yourself credit for that. There does need to be some amount of good job and some amount of recognition of the effort you're making and the results of the effort. Just being human, it's a lot easier to stay motivated when you are seeing results. And so make sure you are seeing results. I understand having a certain amount of humility or even imposter syndrome to the point where you don't want to give yourself credit for anything, but do make sure that you do. Do give yourself credit for showing up and doing what you need to do and seeing results from that effort, seeing progress in the strategy that you've taken on. When you know that stuff is working, you will keep working. And you will keep working, you know? And lastly, under the umbrella of grace, we want to make sure that we are honest with ourselves and kind to ourselves. Give yourself room to mess up, to make ugly sounds, and find your way to the progress within the process. With my students, practice is a part of my studio. It's a part of my expectations. So I also teach them how to practice. I also give homework with specificity as to what I want you to accomplish in the homework, how to approach it, what to do. That way you're never out treading water, floating in the middle of the ocean, wondering what am I supposed to be doing out here? I always want to make sure that my students know exactly what they're supposed to be doing and have a plan of action for it. As a teacher myself, I always want my students to be able to come to me if they're in need when it comes to their voice, even when it comes to being effective in their practice. So that concludes my checklist for an effective and successful practice session. I hope you all were able to learn a thing or two and are able to implement this in your own practice sessions. Feel free to create your own practice technique and strategy, maybe loosely based on this or doing something entirely different, but I hope this gave you a really great starting place. And if you're looking for a vocal coach, I am available, so feel free to reach out to me. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you have any more questions about practice or anything voice, or if you want more videos like this, please leave your suggestions in the comments below. I look forward to receiving them, and I look forward to getting back to you all. Thank you again for coming by, for joining me, for learning a thing or two, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and happy practicing! Bye! Practice should be thoughtful, practical, and useful. I'm gonna have to stop and do each of these. Practice should be thoughtful, practical, and useful.